My mom stole my $50,000 savings account to pay for my sister's dream wedding. I did not cry. I did not make a scene. I just made one phone call. And in the middle of the wedding reception, while 200 guests were on the dance floor and my sister was laughing in her dress under the string lights, the music stopped. The DJ turned it off. The venue manager walked to the center of the room. And what happened next in that ballroom in Phoenix? Arizona turned the most expensive night of my family's life into the night nobody talked about the way they planned to talk about it. Before this story goes anywhere, I need you to understand two things. First, the $50,000 was real. It was 10 years of my life, 10 years of double shifts at a hospital, 10 years of buying store-brand groceries, 10 years of driving a car with 200,000 miles on it because I had decided at 22 years old that I was going to build a savings account that nobody could touch and nobody could take. I had done that, every month, without missing a month, for 10 years. Second, my mother knew exactly what she was doing. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a mistake. This was a woman who had access to a joint account that I had made the error of maintaining with her from the time I was 18. An account I had been meaning to transfer to a solo account for 3 years and had kept putting off because she was my mother and I trusted her, and I had convinced myself that trust was the same as safety. It was not the same as safety. I found out on a Wednesday morning in February when I logged into my banking app to check my balance the way I did every Wednesday morning. The number I saw was not $50,000. The number I saw was $412. I sat at my kitchen table for approximately 30 seconds looking at that number. Then I called the bank. The bank told me there had been a series of transfers over the previous 11 days. 8 transfers in total, moving money from my savings into an external account I did not recognize. The transfers had been authorized by the joint account holder, which was my mother, which meant they were technically legal under the account structure because her name was on the account the same as mine. I hung up with the bank. I sat with the $412 for a few more seconds. Then I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, and before I said a single word, she said, "Lauren, I can explain. Brittany's venue required full payment last week or they were going to cancel, and we were 8 weeks out and the deposits were non-refundable, and I did not have another option." I said, "You took my savings to pay for Brittany's wedding." She said, "It's family, you'll get it back." I said, "Mom, when?" She said, "After the wedding, we'll figure it out." I said, "You took $50,000 from my account without asking me." She said, "Lauren, your sister has been planning this for 2 years. You know how much this means to her." I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, "Okay, Mom." She said, "You're not upset." I said, "I'll talk to you later." I hung up. I was not okay, but I was also not going to have the emotional conversation my mother expected me to have. Because while she was on the phone explaining Brittany's venue deposits and non-refundable contracts, I was already thinking about something else entirely. I was thinking about a woman named Sandra Cole at a collections and civil litigation firm in Phoenix whom I had met at a hospital administrative training 2 years earlier. Sandra had given me her card and said, "If you ever have a financial dispute that needs legal teeth, call me." I had kept the card. I pulled up her number. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and stay with me through every section of this story. Because what happened at that wedding reception is only the last part of what this story is actually about. My name is Lauren Mercer, and I am 32 years old. I grew up in Mesa, Arizona, in a 3-bedroom house on a street where the yards were mostly gravel because grass was expensive in the desert, and the families on our street were the kind of families for whom expensive was a relevant consideration at all times. My mother, Patricia Mercer, had raised me and my sister Brittany alone from the time I was 9 years old, which was when my father Raymond decided that the life he had built in Mesa was not the life he wanted and left for Tucson with a woman he had met at a trade conference, and with whom he would have 2 more children and a much larger house. My mother had worked as a payroll administrator for a dental supply company for 23 years. Her salary was real but not comfortable, the specific category of income that covered the bills and left a small amount over and required careful management of that small amount, or the bills would not be covered. She was good at managing it. She was organized about money in the technical sense, which meant she tracked the bills and paid them on time and made sure the lights stayed on and the car insurance did not lapse. What she was less good at was the distinction between managing money and valuing money, between knowing what something cost and understanding what it took to build it. My sister Brittany was 3 years younger than me. She was the daughter who had her mother's features and her mother's social ease, and the specific quality of someone for whom the world arranged itself pleasantly, because the world tended to arrange itself pleasantly for people who moved through it with warmth and beauty and the expectation of being liked. Brittany was genuinely kind. I want to be clear about that. She was not calculating or manipulative. She was a person who had always been given things because she was easy to give things to and who had not developed, through any fault of her own, a deep understanding of what things cost to build. I was the older daughter, and from a fairly early age, I was the daughter who operated differently. My father leaving when I was 9 had produced a specific effect on me that I did not fully understand until I was in my mid-20s, and a therapist named Dr. Marcus Webb helped me see it clearly. The effect was this. I had decided, somewhere in the first year after he left, that the way to never be in the position my mother was in, scrambling, rearranging, making the numbers work in the aftermath of something she had not chosen, was to build something so solid that no departure and no disruption could touch it. I had decided this at 9 years old without those words, without any formal framework. I had just understood that the solid thing mattered, and that I was the one who was going to build it. I started working at 15 at a grocery store near our house, which was the first job I could legally hold, and which I took the first week I was eligible. My mother had not asked me to work. She had not suggested it was necessary. I had gotten the job on my own because I understood, in the way that children of financial instability understood things, that the difference between having money and not having money was not primarily about circumstance. It was primarily about decision. I worked through high school and went to Arizona State on a partial academic scholarship and paid my own living expenses through part-time work during school and full-time work every summer. And I graduated in 2015 with a degree in healthcare administration and a job offer from Banner Health in Phoenix that paid $41,000 per year, which was more money than I had ever made, and which I received the same way I received everything, with the specific orientation of someone who understood it as a resource to be deployed carefully rather than a reward to be spent. Banner Health was where I built the foundation. I started the savings account the month I got the first paycheck. Not a large contribution, $200. The amount was not the point. The decision was the point. Every month, regardless of what else was happening, something went into the savings account. The amount grew as my career grew. I moved from coordinator roles into hospital administrative management, took on more responsibility, got promoted twice, changed positions once for a significant salary increase. And every time my income grew, I directed a meaningful portion of the increase directly into the savings account before I adjusted my lifestyle to match the new income. This discipline produced $53,000 over 10 years. I had let the balance drift back to approximately $50,000 after a car repair the previous fall. The account had my mother's name on it because I had opened it at 18, when I did not fully understand the implications of a joint account, and had not removed her name in the years since because she was my mother, and removing her name felt like a statement I was not ready to make. The statement I was not ready to make in advance became a statement I needed to respond to after the fact. My mother had accessed the account 11 days before I checked the balance on that Wednesday morning in February. She had moved the money in 8 transfers, which I understood later was a strategy. 8 transfers spread over 11 days attracted less immediate attention than one large wire and gave the wedding venue payment time to clear before I noticed. She had thought about this. That was the part I kept coming back to in the days after I found out. Not that she had done it, that she had planned it. 8 transfers over 11 days was not a panicked impulse. It was a structured decision made by a woman who had calculated that I would be upset and had decided the upset was manageable. I was not upset in the way she had calculated. I was clear. And clarity, in my experience, was more useful than upset every single time. The conversation with Sandra Cole happened on the Thursday morning after I found out, which gave me 24 hours to be certain about what I was doing before I made any irreversible steps. I had spent those 24 hours doing 3 things. First, I had gathered every document related to the savings account, the original account opening documents, 12 months of statements, the transaction history showing the 8 transfers with their dates and destination account details, and the bank's written confirmation of the transactions. Second, I had researched Arizona civil law regarding unauthorized transfers from joint accounts, specifically the question of whether my mother's name on the account shielded the transfers from legal challenge. Third, I had been completely silent with my mother and my sister, which had produced 3 calls from my mother and 2 texts from Brittany asking if I was coming to the venue walkthrough that weekend, none of which I had returned. The legal question was the important one, and the answer was nuanced in the way that legal questions about family finances were almost always nuanced. Sandra Cole explained it to me in her office on Thursday morning with the specific directness of someone who had handled many versions of this situation. She said that the joint account structure meant my mother had legal authority to access the funds. She said this did not mean I had no recourse. She said the recourse depended on what I could demonstrate about the nature of the account and the agreement, explicit or implied, between myself and my mother regarding the account's purpose. I told her about the account. I told her I had opened it at 18 when my mother's name was added for logistical reasons, that I had been the sole contributor to the account across 10 years, that my mother had made 0 contributions in that period, and that there had never been any explicit agreement that the funds were available to her for any purpose. I told her my mother had said in our phone call that I would get it back after the wedding, and that we would figure it out, which I characterized as an acknowledgement that she understood the funds were mine, and that the transfer was a borrowing rather than a withdrawal she considered legitimate. Sandra listened to everything. She asked 3 clarifying questions. Then she said, "I can file a civil claim for return of funds based on the implied trust structure of the account and the statements your mother made acknowledging the money as yours. The claim would be against your mother personally, not against the account. If she cannot return the funds, which is likely given that they've been used to pay a vendor, we can pursue a judgment and attach it to assets." She paused. She said, "There is also an alternative approach that is faster and more immediately visible, the wedding venue." I said, "Tell me about that." She said, "The venue was paid with your funds. If we can demonstrate that the payment was made with funds that are subject to a civil claim, we have grounds to put the venue on notice of a disputed payment. Whether they respond to that notice and how they respond is their decision. But they will respond because venues do not want to be in the middle of a civil dispute about the funds they received." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "If they respond during the reception." Sandra said, "We can time the notice strategically. The filing would be with the court today. The notice to the venue would go out through proper legal channels. Timing is a factor we can discuss." I said, "The wedding is in 6 weeks. The reception is at a venue in Scottsdale." Sandra said, "Give me the venue's legal name and the contract details if you have access to them." I had access to them because my mother had mentioned the venue name in our phone call, and I had looked it up and found their standard contract terms on their public website, which included their legal entity name and the notice address for business communications. I wrote down the information on Sandra's notepad. She said, "Lauren, I want to be clear about what happens if we proceed with both the civil claim and the venue notice. Your family will experience the consequences publicly. That may be exactly what the situation warrants. It may also be something you want to think carefully about before it becomes irreversible." I said, "My mother moved $50,000 in 8 transfers across 11 days. She calculated that I would be upset and decided the upset was worth it. I want the calculation to be complete." Sandra said, "I'll file today." She filed the civil claim that afternoon. The claim was against my mother personally for return of funds in the amount of $50,000, based on the 10-year contribution history, establishing an implied trust in the funds. The claim included the bank records and my mother's phone statement acknowledging that I would get it back. The venue notice went out through certified mail the following morning. I returned my mother's calls that evening. Not to discuss the legal action, I was not required to disclose it, and I chose not to. I returned the calls because disappearing entirely felt like a different kind of drama than the drama I was managing, and I wanted to be ordinarily present for the next 6 weeks. My mother answered and said, "Lauren, I've been worried about you. You haven't responded." I said, "I've been processing." She said, "I know you're upset, but it's going to be okay. After the wedding, we'll sit down and work out a plan to get you paid back." I said, "Okay, Mom." She said, "Are you going to the venue walkthrough this weekend?" I said, "I'll try to make it." She said, "Brittany really wants you there." I said, "I know." I went to the venue walkthrough. The venue was called The Terrace at Scottsdale Palms, and it was the kind of event space that existed in the Phoenix metro area, specifically for weddings at the upper end of what families stretch themselves to afford. A converted historic property with landscaped grounds, a ballroom with 30-foot ceilings and industrial string lighting, a catering kitchen, and a bridal suite with a vanity mirror ringed in warm bulbs that appeared in approximately 40% of the Instagram posts that came out of events held there. The rental was $44,000 for the full venue package, including catering coordination and AV services. My mother had paid $40,000 as a deposit from my account and had structured the remaining $4,000 as a balance due on the day of the event. I knew all of this because my mother had explained it to me in our second phone call, after she understood that I was not going to disappear quietly, and that keeping me informed was part of managing my response. She had said the numbers with the specific combination of pride and defensiveness of someone who had done something they knew was wrong, and was framing it in the most favorable possible terms. The walkthrough was on a Saturday morning. Brittany was there with her fiancé, a man named Tyler who worked in commercial real estate and who was pleasant and well-dressed, and who had the quality of someone who understood that his fiancé's family had complicated dynamics and had decided to move through those dynamics with as much neutrality as possible. My mother was there. Brittany's 2 bridesmaids were there. I was there. The venue coordinator, a woman named Ashley who had the professional warmth of someone who did this event every weekend and had seen every family dynamic and who had learned to be pleasant and competent regardless of what was happening beneath the social surface, walked us through the evening's flow. She showed us the cocktail hour space and the ballroom layout and the table configurations and the lighting plan and the catering flow and the timeline for the evening. I asked specific questions about the timeline, about what happened if a vendor had a service issue during the event, about the venue's cancellation and refund policy, about what the balance due process looked like on the day of the event. Ashley answered all of them professionally and without visible suspicion. She did not know about the civil claim or the venue notice, which had gone to the venue's registered agent at a different address than the event planning office. The event planning office and the legal department of the venue's parent company were separate operational units. My mother gave me a look at one point during the walkthrough that said she thought I was asking too many questions. I gave her a look back that said I was just interested in the details. Brittany said, "Lauren, you're so organized. Mom always says you're the organized one." I said, "I like to understand how things work." Tyler said, "That's a useful quality." I said, "It comes in handy." After the walkthrough, Brittany and I walked through the ballroom alone for a few minutes while our mother talked to Ashley about the floral arrangements. Brittany looked at the space with the expression of someone who had been picturing this room for a long time and was now standing in it and finding that it matched the picture. She said, "Can you believe this is actually happening?" I looked at the ballroom. I thought about the $40,000 that had paid for this specific room and this specific lighting and this specific moment of my sister standing in it with the expression of someone whose dream was intact. I said, "It's beautiful, Britt." She said, "I'm so glad you're here. I know things have been weird. Mom told me you were upset about the money thing." I said, "We're working through it." She said, "I didn't know the details of how she was paying for everything. I want you to know that." I looked at her. I believed her. Brittany was not a person who tracked financial mechanics. She had told the venue she wanted this room and had trusted her mother to handle the payment and had not asked where the payment came from. This was consistent with who she had always been. I said, "I know, Britt." She said, "You're my sister. Whatever happens with the money stuff, you're my sister." I said, "I know." She said, "So you'll be there at the wedding?" I said, "I'll be there." I was there. The wedding day was a Saturday in April, which in Phoenix meant the weather was at the specific inflection point between the pleasant spring that made Arizona beautiful and the scorching summer that reminded you why the pleasant spring had to be appreciated when it arrived. The temperature was 78 degrees by 4 in the afternoon, and the Scottsdale Palms venue had its cooling systems running at the setting that communicated. The outdoor portion will be brief. The indoor portion will be worth it. The ceremony was at 5 o'clock in the venue's garden courtyard, which had mature desert landscaping and string lights in the olive trees and white chairs arranged in rows on either side of the aisle. The ceremony was genuinely beautiful. Brittany was genuinely beautiful. Tyler cried when she came down the aisle, which made my mother cry, which made the two bridesmaids cry, which made approximately 40% of the guests cry in the sympathetic way that wedding ceremonies produced crying. I stood in the row where family sat, and I watched my sister marry the man she had chosen, and I let the ceremony be what it was, which was real and moving and separate from everything else that was happening. Because the ceremony was separate from everything else that was happening. What was also happening, at a level invisible to the 200 guests settling into the cocktail hour at 6:30, was the following. The civil claim I had filed had been served on my mother 6 days earlier. She had received the legal papers at home on a Monday morning and had called me within the hour in a state of controlled panic, which I could hear in the specific tightness of her voice. She had said, "Lauren, what did you do?" I had said, "I filed a civil claim for return of funds." "Sandra Cole is my attorney. Her number is on the papers." My mother had said, "At the wedding, Lauren. You're doing this at the wedding." I had said, "The claim was filed 5 weeks ago. The timing of the service was not in my control." It partially was in my control. Sandra and I had discussed the service timing. My mother had hired her own attorney within 48 hours. Her attorney had contacted Sandra, and there had been an exchange of letters about the claim's merits and the account structure and my mother's legal position. Sandra had told me after the first exchange, "Her attorney is making the joint account argument, which is the argument they have. Our counter is the 10-year contribution history and the phone statement. We have the better case." What my mother's attorney had not successfully addressed was the venue notice. The venue notice had been delivered to the venue's legal department 3 days after I filed the civil claim. The legal department of the venue's parent company, a Phoenix hospitality group that operated 4 event properties, had internal protocols for disputed payment notices. Those protocols included putting the specific event on a watch status and requiring event management to complete a payment confirmation review before the final balance was released for the event's operational expenditures. What this meant practically was that the venue's final balance, the $4,000 still owed, had not been cleared for payment because the legal department had placed the account on hold pending resolution of the civil claim notice. What this meant on the day of the reception was that the venue's general manager, a man named David Kim, was aware that there was a legal dispute associated with the payment for this specific event, and that his protocol required him to address the situation before allowing the event to proceed past the point at which the disputed balance became relevant to the evening's services. The DJ's contract, the catering's final service, and the event staff's overtime coverage all fell within the scope of services funded by the event balance. The event balance was under legal hold. David Kim was professional about it. He was not unkind. He waited until the cocktail hour had wound down and the guests had moved into the ballroom for the reception dinner, which meant he waited until the most visible moment of the evening when the most people were in the most public space possible. He walked to the DJ booth. He spoke to the DJ briefly. The music stopped. The room went from the specific energy of 200 people enjoying a wedding reception to a confused quiet in approximately 4 seconds. David Kim walked to the center of the ballroom floor, where he could address the room clearly, and he said, "Good evening. I apologize for the interruption. I'm the general manager of this property. We have an administrative matter related to this event that requires a brief conversation with the event organizers before we can continue. If Patricia Mercer could please come speak with me, we'll get this resolved as quickly as possible." My mother was at the family table. She stood up. 200 people watched her walk across the ballroom floor to where David Kim was standing. Brittany was at the head table. Her expression moved through confusion into something I recognized as the beginning of understanding that something was wrong. Tyler put his hand over hers. My mother reached David Kim and he spoke to her quietly. I was not close enough to hear the conversation. What I could see was my mother's face, which went through its own sequence. The initial receiving of the information, the attempt to manage the response publicly, the specific expression of a woman who had calculated what would happen when $50,000 moved from one account to another, and who was discovering that the calculation had not been complete. She took out her phone. She made a call. The call lasted 4 minutes. Then she spoke to David Kim again. David Kim walked back to the DJ booth. The music restarted. The room exhaled. My mother came back to the family table and sat down. She did not look at me directly. She picked up her water glass and she set it back down, and she looked at the head table where Brittany was looking at her with the expression of someone who had just understood that the administrative matter had not been administrative. My Aunt Rita, who was sitting beside me, leaned over and said quietly, "Lauren, do you know what that was about?" I said, "An administrative matter." She looked at me. I looked at the dance floor. The music played. The reception finished at 11. By 10:30, most of the guests had shifted from confusion about the music interruption to the collective decision-making of people at an open bar at 10:30 who were choosing enjoyment over analysis. The interruption became a thing that happened that people would mention later rather than a thing that defined the evening, which was the specific resilience of wedding receptions as social events. They were designed to absorb disruption and continue. Brittany danced with Tyler. She danced with the bridesmaids. She danced with my mother in the specific reconciling way of a daughter who was trying to be present for her wedding while processing that something complicated had happened. She danced with me briefly during a song that neither of us had chosen, but that was playing when she came over to where I was standing near the edge of the dance floor and took my hand and said, "Come on." I danced with my sister at her wedding. That was real, and it was mine, and it was not erased by anything else that was happening. My mother found me near the exit at 10:45 as the event was winding down. She had the expression of someone who had been managing a public situation for 4 hours and was now, in the last 15 minutes before she could leave, allowing herself to feel what the situation actually cost her. She said, "That was humiliating." I said, "Mom." She said, "In front of 200 people." I said, "You moved $50,000 from my account in 8 transfers across 11 days. You planned it. You made a calculation." She said, "It's family. I told you I would pay it back." I said, "When?" She said, "We'll figure it out." I looked at her. I said, "That is the second time you have said that sentence to me. We'll figure it out. I have a court date in 6 weeks. My attorney will be there. I need you to bring yours." She said, "Lauren, after everything I've done for you." I said, "I love you. I also need my money back. Both of those things are true at the same time, and the second one has a legal process now." She said, "This is your sister's wedding night." I said, "Yes, And you paid for it with my savings account. I did not do this to ruin her night. You did something that had consequences, and the consequences are visible now." She was quiet. She said, "How much is the claim for?" I said, "50,000 plus legal costs and interest. Sandra can give you the exact figure." She said, "Lauren, I cannot write you a check for $50,000. I said, "I know, that's why there's a court process. The judgment can be structured." She looked at me with the expression of a woman who had thought she knew how her daughter would respond to a difficult situation, and who was discovering that the response was different from the one she had modeled. She had modeled upset. She had modeled hurt feelings and a tense conversation, and an eventual family reconciliation around a vague repayment plan that stretched indefinitely into the future. She had not modeled Sandra Cole. She said, "Where did you learn to do this?" I said, "You raised me to handle things, Mom. I'm handling it." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I need to go find your sister." She walked back into the ballroom. I watched her go. The civil case was settled 6 months later through a structured agreement negotiated between Sandra and my mother's attorney. My mother agreed to a repayment plan, monthly payments over 4 years that would return the full principal plus legal costs. The agreement was documented and enforceable. The first payment arrived on the 15th of the month following the settlement, which was the date the agreement specified, which told me that my mother's attorney had explained to her in terms she understood what would happen if the payment schedule was not honored. My relationship with my mother during those 6 months was the specific relationship of two people who loved each other and were also in a legal process together. We were not estranged. We were careful. We had Sunday phone calls that were shorter than they used to be, and family dinners on holidays where we sat at the same table and spoke with the specific consideration of people who had said hard, true things to each other and were in the process of deciding what the relationship looked like on the other side of the hard, true things. By the 1-year mark, the relationship had found its new shape, not the same as before, closer to honest, which I decided was better. Brittany called me 2 months after the wedding. She had found out the full details by then. My mother had told her in a conversation I was not part of, and Brittany had called me directly afterward. She said, "Why didn't you tell me before the wedding?" I said, "Because I didn't want your wedding to be about this. I wanted you to have your wedding." She said, "But the music." I said, "The music was a consequence of what happened, not something I arranged for the drama of it." She was quiet. She said, "Mom could have ruined everything." I said, "Yes." She said, "She took your money." I said, "Yes." She said, "And you still came, you still danced with me." I said, "You're my sister, those are separate things." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'm going to pay you back too. I know it's not my legal responsibility, but I'm going to pay you back. Every month, whatever Tyler and I can manage." I said, "Britt, you don't have to." She said, "I know, I want to. Because you came to my wedding and you danced with me and you let me have my night even while that was happening. And that matters to me more than I know how to say." I said, "Okay." She said, "Okay." Brittany has sent a payment every month since that call. The amounts are small. She and Tyler are building their own life, and the amounts are what they can afford. But the payments arrive on time, every month, with a text that says something brief like, "For the fund," or sometimes just a heart emoji with a $sign. I have a new savings account. Solo. My name only. The balance is growing the same way it always grew, which is 1 month at a time, with the specific discipline of someone who understands that the solid thing matters and that she is the one who builds it. Phoenix in May has the quality of a city holding its breath before the heat fully arrives. The mornings are still manageable, and the evenings are still beautiful, and for about 3 weeks in the transition between spring and summer, you remember exactly why people chose the desert and forgot why they should have been more careful. I drive to work on Tuesday mornings along a route that passes a stretch of the Scottsdale Palms venue property. I can see the olive trees from the road. The string lights are not visible in the morning, but I know they are there. I drive past without stopping, which is the appropriate response to a place that is both the site of something beautiful and the site of something difficult. And those two things do not cancel each other out because that is not how things worked. The savings account has $4,100 in it. I lost ground, and I am rebuilding it the only way I know how, which is month by month, methodically, with the specific patience of someone who has done this before and knows it works if you do not stop doing it. My mother's payments arrive on the 15th. She has not missed one. We have Sunday calls that are getting incrementally more honest as the months pass. She said something on a call last month that I did not expect, which was, "I thought you would just let it go, because you always handled things. I thought handle it meant absorb it." She paused. "I understand now that those are different things." I said, "Yes, they are." We were quiet for a moment, and then she asked about work, and I told her about work, and the call ended the way most of our calls ended now, which was with something real said and something regular happening after it. Sandra Cole sent me a referral 3 months after the settlement. A friend of hers who had a situation involving a business dispute and needed the kind of analytical thinking Sandra had observed in how I approached my own case. I met with the woman and helped her understand her options. Sandra said afterward, "You should consider this work. You're good at it." I said, "I'm good at knowing what I'm owed and having the documentation to prove it." She laughed and said, "That is 90% of this work." Here is the thing I want you to take from this story. $50,000 did not disappear. It moved to a place where a court could see it and a judge could address it and a payment structure could return it. The money was real. The documentation was real. The discipline of 10 years of building was real. And the consequence was real, because I had made sure there was a mechanism for the consequence to be real. Most people who are taken from depend on the person who took from them to decide to give it back. That dependence produces exactly the outcome you expect from someone who already decided once that taking was acceptable. Sandra Cole produces a different outcome. If this story hit something true for you today, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel and ring the notification bell. Every story here is this honest. Take care of yourselves.